A young girl's trembling voice, a child wrapped in a blue blanket, and a truth that could shatter everything you thought you knew. This is the story of Deborah, Cynthia, and the devastating web of lies woven around them. It's a tale of betrayal, courage, and the relentless search for justice that will leave you questioning how far you'd go to uncover the truth. Stay with me until the end of this powerful story from African Legacy Tales. You won't believe the twists that await, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I'd love to know. Now, let's dive into the story. If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The familiar words echoed through St. Ed's Church, followed by that ceremonial pause that usually passes in reverent silence, but not today. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright summer light that made everyone turn their heads. In the doorway stood Cynthia Mitchell, her dark hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears, and in her arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was a sleeping infant no more than 3 months old. The 16-year-old's hands trembled as she held the baby, but her voice rang clear through the stunned silence. "I'm sorry, Deborah, but I can't let you marry him, not without knowing the truth about Martin." The bride, Deborah Reynolds, gorgeous in her designer wedding gown, stared at her younger sister with a mixture of confusion and horror. The groom, Martin Lancaster, had gone deathly pale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. 300 guests sat frozen in their pews, witnessing the scene unfold like a car crash in slow motion. "This is his son," Cynthia continued, her voice breaking, "and I can prove it." The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a small whimper that seemed to echo in the cavernous space. "Here's the hook to keep you glued." What more could Cynthia possibly reveal? The sound shattered the paralysis that had gripped the gathering, gasps and whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Deborah's mother half rose from her seat in the front pew, one hand pressed to her mouth. The priest looked uncertainly between the bride and groom, his prayer book hanging forgotten at his side, but it was Deborah's reaction that caught everyone's attention. She hadn't moved, hadn't screamed, hadn't fallen apart as one might expect. Instead, she stood absolutely still, her bouquet of white roses clutched so tightly that a thorn had pricked her finger, a small spot of red blooming on her white lace glove. "Deborah," Martin started to say, reaching for her arm, "I can explain." She jerked away from his touch as if it burned her. When she spoke, her voice was unnaturally calm, like the eye of a hurricane. "How old is he, Cynthia?" 3 months, Cynthia answered, taking a step forward into the church. "He was born on March 15th. The date seemed to hit Deborah like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, and those closest to her could see her counting backward in her mind. 9 months before March, last June, the month she'd been in London for her fellowship, when Martin had insisted on staying behind because of work commitments, when Cynthia had just turned 16. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture too horrific to contemplate. But there was more to this story than anyone in the church could guess, more than even Cynthia, standing there with her baby, could know. Because while everyone's attention was focused on the drama unfolding at the altar, only the bride noticed something else. Martin's best man, Ed, had slipped quietly out the side door of the church, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Deborah opened her eyes, and for the first time since her sister's entrance, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or forgiveness, it was the smile of someone who had just figured out the solution to a complex puzzle, one with pieces scattered across years of carefully constructed lies. "You're right, Cynthia," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "Everyone deserves to know the truth about Martin, but I don't think even you know the whole story yet." The baby began to cry in earnest now, his wails echoing off the vaulted ceiling as if he too sensed the weight of the secrets about to be revealed. Cynthia tried to quiet him, rocking him gently, but her eyes never left her sister's face. What did Deborah mean? What more could there possibly be to know? The answer to that question would change not just this wedding day, but the lives of everyone present in ways none of them could imagine. 6 months earlier, Deborah Reynolds sat in her favorite corner of Carter's coffee shop, staring at the email that would change everything. The prestigious London fellowship she'd applied for months ago had finally responded. They wanted her to join their program for 3 months. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to work with some of the world's leading researchers in childhood trauma therapy. But as she looked across the table at her sister Cynthia's excited face, something felt off. The 16-year-old had been different lately, more withdrawn, less likely to meet her eyes. Deborah had initially attributed it to typical teenage moodiness, but now she wasn't so sure. "You have to go," Cynthia insisted, picking at her untouched blueberry muffin. "You've been talking about this fellowship since forever." She wore their mother's old cardigan, the one she'd claimed after Mom's cancer diagnosis 2 years ago. It hung loose on her thin frame, making her look younger than her 16 years. "I don't know," Deborah replied, studying her sister's face. "The timing isn't great. You've seemed troubled lately, and with Mom still in recovery." "I'm fine," Cynthia cut her off too quickly. "Mom's doing better, and Martin said he'd keep an eye on things while you're gone, right?" The mention of her fiancé brought a small smile to Deborah's face, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Martin Lancaster had been her rock through their mother's illness, through the long nights of the hospital, through the uncertainties of recovery. He'd proposed 6 months ago, getting down on one knee in their mother's hospital room, promising to always be there for both Reynolds women. It had seemed perfect, almost too perfect. "Martin's been working late a lot," Deborah said slowly, remembering the increasing frequency of his cancelled dinner plans and weekend absences. "Some big case he can't talk about." Cynthia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "He's a good guy, Deborah, he'll take care of everything." The conviction in her sister's voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it sent a chill down Deborah's spine. There was something in Cynthia's tone, something that reminded Deborah of her therapy sessions with troubled teens when they were trying too hard to convince themselves of something they knew wasn't true. But before Deborah could probe further, the coffee shop's door chimed, and Ed Kraft walked in, Martin's best friend and law partner. He spotted them and headed over, his usually cheerful face oddly serious. "Deborah," he said, nodding to her before turning to Cynthia. "Cynthia, your mom called the office looking for you, something about a doctor's appointment." Cynthia stood up so abruptly she knocked over her coffee cup, dark liquid spreading across the table like a stain of secrets about to spill. "I forgot, I'll go now." She practically ran from the cafe, leaving Deborah staring after her in confusion. Ed slid into Cynthia's vacated seat, his expression troubled. "Deborah, there's something you should know about Martin," but his next words were cut off by Deborah's phone ringing. It was Martin. "Hey, love," his voice came through smooth as honey. "I just got out of court dinner tonight, there's something important I need to discuss." Deborah looked up at Ed, who was now staring intently at his hands. "Actually," she said into the phone, "I need to talk to you too. I got the London Fellowship." There was a pause on the other end, just a fraction too long. "That's wonderful news," Martin said finally. "We'll celebrate tonight, 7 o'clock at Alessandro's." After hanging up, Deborah turned to Ed, but he was already standing. "I should go," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Congratulations on the fellowship." He hesitated, then added, "Deborah, be careful." "Careful of what?" "Just watch carefully, sometimes the things we think we know about people, they're not what they seem." As Deborah watched him leave, her therapist's intuition was screaming that something was very wrong. She pulled out her laptop and opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "Things that don't add up," and began to list: 1. Cynthia's sudden behavior changes, 2. Martin's late nights, 3. Ed's warning, 4. Mom's missed appointment, 5. The timing of everything. She didn't know it then, but this list would become the key to unraveling a web of deception that went far deeper than she could imagine. Because while Deborah was piecing together small inconsistencies, she had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, at dinner with Martin, she would discover the first real clue: a text message not meant for her eyes, from a number she didn't recognize, with 4 words that would haunt her: the test was positive. As she closed her laptop, a young mother walked past her table, pushing a stroller. The baby inside caught Deborah's eye and smiled, a bright, innocent smile that made Deborah's heart ache with a premonition she couldn't quite understand. Later, she would remember this moment and realize that sometimes the universe sends us signs, if only we know how to read them. The coffee shop's clock struck 3, its chimes mixing with the autumn wind rattling the windows. In 6 hours, Deborah would be sitting across from Martin at Alessandro's, watching him lie to her face about his important news. In 3 months, she would be returning from London to find her world turned upside down. And in 6 months, she would be standing at the altar, waiting for the perfect moment to spring a trap that had been months in the making. But for now, she sat in her corner of Carter's coffee shop, surrounded by the scent of coffee and secrets, not yet knowing that the real mystery wasn't what was happening behind her back, it was why everyone seemed so desperate to keep her from discovering it. Alessandro's restaurant buzzed with the gentle murmur of dinner conversation, but Deborah barely noticed it. Her attention was fixed on Martin's hands as he nervously adjusted his tie for the third time since they'd been seated. In their 5 years together, she'd learned to read his tells. The tie adjustment meant he was about to lie. "I've been thinking about your fellowship," he began, his voice carefully measured. 3 months is a long time to be apart, especially with the wedding coming up. Deborah took a sip of her wine, letting the silence stretch between them. The text message she'd glimpsed on his phone earlier kept flashing in her mind. The test was positive. She'd only seen it because his phone had lit up when the waiter passed by, a brief moment that changed everything. "I was thinking," Martin continued, "maybe you should decline it. We could move the wedding up instead." The wine turned sour in Deborah's mouth. "Move it up? Why?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again. He reached for it instinctively, then stopped himself, but Deborah had already seen the caller ID, Cynthia. Why would her 16-year-old sister be calling her fiancé at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening? "Aren't you going to get that?" she asked, her therapist's training kicking in as she maintained a neutral expression. "It's just work," Martin said, another adjustment of his tie. "It can wait." Deborah felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. She thought about Cynthia's strange behavior at the coffee shop earlier, about Ed's warning, about all the little things that hadn't quite added up over the past few months. "You know what's interesting about being a trauma therapist?" she said, watching Martin's face carefully. "You learn to recognize patterns, how people act when they're carrying secrets, the small tells that give them away." Martin's hand froze halfway to his tie. "Deborah, for instance," she continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "teenagers who experience trauma often become withdrawn, especially from family members they're closest to. They wear oversized clothes, skip doctor's appointments, make excuses for the people who've hurt them." The color drained from Martin's face. "Whatever you think is happening, and then there are the adults involved," Deborah pressed on. "They get nervous, work late, push for sudden changes in plans, they adjust their ties when they lie." Martin's hands dropped to his lap. In that moment, he looked less like the successful lawyer she'd agreed to marry and more like the guilty men she'd seen in courthouse corridors. "It's not what you think," he started to say, but Deborah was already standing up. "I'm taking the fellowship," she announced, "and when I get back, we're having the wedding exactly as planned, June 15th, no changes." "Deborah, please." "Oh, and Martin," she picked up her purse, her movements deliberate and calm, "tell my sister I'll see her at home." The drive home was a blur. Deborah's mind raced through possibilities, each more devastating than the last. But when she walked through their front door, the scene that greeted her stopped her cold. Cynthia sat on the living room couch, their mother Patricia beside her, both of them crying. On the coffee table lay what looked like medical papers. "Deborah," her mother said, rising shakily, "we need to talk." But Cynthia spoke first, her voice small and broken. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Deborah felt the room spin as pieces of the puzzle slammed together. Martin's late nights, Cynthia's baggy clothes, the missed doctor's appointment, the text about the positive test. "How far along?" Deborah heard herself ask, though she already knew the answer. 6 weeks, Cynthia whispered. Deborah did the math. 6 weeks ago, she'd been preparing for a conference in Boston. 6 weeks ago, Martin had canceled their weekly family dinner because of work commitments. But there was something else, something in the way Cynthia wouldn't meet her eyes, something in the way their mother kept looking between her daughters with a mixture of grief and fear. "There's more," Patricia said softly. "Deborah, sit down, please." Deborah remained standing, her back against the wall. "More?" Cynthia finally looked up, her young face aged by guilt and fear. "It's about Dad's accident 10 years ago, the one that killed him." She swallowed hard. It wasn't an accident, and Martin knows why. The world tilted on its axis. Deborah's father's death had devastated their family, but they'd all accepted the official ruling, a tragic car accident on a rainy night. What could Martin possibly have to do with something that happened a decade ago? Ed left this for you, Cynthia continued, reaching for an envelope on the table. He said if anything happened to him, you needed to read it. Deborah's blood ran cold. What do you mean, if anything happened to him? The sound of screeching tires outside cut through the tension. Through the living room window, Deborah caught a glimpse of Martin's car pulling up, but he wasn't alone. Ed was in the passenger seat, his face bloody. Patricia rushed to lock the front door, moving with an urgency Deborah had never seen in her mother before. We don't have much time, she said, her voice stronger now. Deborah, whatever you do, don't let Martin know that you know, not yet. Everything depends on it. Cynthia clutched the medical papers to her chest, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Deborah, I wanted to tell you sooner, but they threatened Mom's cancer treatment funding if I did. The pieces were still falling into place, but the picture they were forming was darker than anything Deborah could have imagined. This wasn't just about a betrayal or an unplanned pregnancy, this was about something much bigger, something that stretched back a decade and threatened to destroy not just her future but her entire understanding of the past. As Martin's key turned in the lock, Deborah made a decision: she wouldn't confront him, not yet. First, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. She needed to know why her father really died, why Ed was bleeding, and most importantly, why everyone seemed terrified of the man she was supposed to marry. Trust me, she whispered to Cynthia and her mother as Martin's footsteps approached the door. I'm going to fix this, all of it. What Deborah didn't know then was that her path to justice would take exactly 3 months, the length of her fellowship in London, 3 months to uncover the truth, to gather evidence, and to plan the perfect moment to expose it all. And that moment would come, just not in the way anyone expected. Because sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to let your prey think they've won, even if it means walking down the aisle toward the man who destroyed your family. The London rain pelted against Deborah's apartment window as she spread her evidence across the small desk. After 2 months at the fellowship, she'd established a routine: days spent studying childhood trauma therapy, evenings dedicated to unraveling the web of lies surrounding her family. Her laptop displayed Ed's email, sent through an encrypted account the day after that terrible night at home. Deborah, if you're reading this, it means things have gone exactly as I feared. What I'm about to tell you about Martin and your father's death puts us both at risk, but you need to know the truth. 10 years ago, I was a first-year associate at Lancaster and Wright Law, where your father was investigating corporate fraud. He discovered something massive: a network of medical insurance fraud that reached into the highest levels of hospital administration. Martin's father, Richard Lancaster, was orchestrating a scheme to deny critical medical treatments while pocketing insurance payments. The night your father died, he'd called me. He had proof, but he never made it to our meeting. I've spent the last decade gathering evidence, working my way up through the firm, getting close to Martin. The guilt of my silence has eaten at me every day, but I needed to be sure I could prove it all. The attached files contain everything I've found: bank records, emails, the real accident report that was buried. But be careful how you use this information. They control medical board approval for experimental treatments, including your mother's cancer therapy. Watch your back, trust no one at the firm, Ed. Deborah opened the first attachment with trembling hands. There it was in black and white, the real police report from the night of her father's death. The brake lines had been cut, it wasn't an accident at all. Her phone buzzed, a text from Cynthia: baby kicked today, Mom's taking me to another checkup tomorrow, Martin keeps asking questions, miss you. Deborah's heart clenched. She'd insisted Cynthia continue pretending everything was normal, even attending monthly dinner dates with Martin. It was crucial he didn't suspect they knew anything. Meanwhile, Deborah had been building her case meticulously. She opened her journal, reviewing her recent discoveries. 1. Richard Lancaster's signature on denied treatment appeals matched signatures on documents authorizing massive payments to offshore accounts. 2. The timing of her mother's miraculous acceptance into an experimental cancer treatment program coincided with Martin's proposal. 3. A pattern of young pregnant women whose medical care was mysteriously funded, followed by closed adoption records. 4. Ed's sudden business trip to Singapore right after he'd left those bruises couldn't be coincidental. A knock at her door made her freeze. It was nearly midnight in London. Who could be visiting? Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face: Janet Wright, Richard Lancaster's former legal secretary, who'd reached out after seeing Deborah's carefully placed inquiries about old case files. I'm sorry for the late hour, Janet said when Deborah opened the door, her hands clutched a thick manila envelope. "But after what you told me about Martin and your sister, there's something you need to see." Deborah ushered her in quickly, clearing space at the small table. Janet pulled out a stack of documents, her hands shaking slightly. "I kept copies of everything," she explained, "insurance claims, medical records, private adoption arrangements. Richard and Martin, they've been doing this for years, finding vulnerable young girls, offering to help with their pregnancies, then pressuring them into giving up their babies." "Giving them up to whom?" Deborah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Wealthy clients of the firm, couples who can't have children of their own. The babies are placed through private adoptions, all records sealed. The biological mothers are paid for their silence, if they survive." Deborah's blood ran cold. "If they survive?" Janet's eyes filled with tears. "There have been complications, deaths made to look like accidents, just like your father's." A piece of paper slipped from the stack, landing face up on the table. Deborah's heart stopped. It was a photo of a young woman, maybe Cynthia's age, lying in a hospital bed, the date stamp from 8 years ago. The girl's face was bruised, but Deborah recognized her, Martin's former secretary, whose move to California had seemed so sudden. "Her name was Rebecca," Janet said softly. "She was 16, like your sister. She died during childbirth, the official report says complications, but I saw the real medical records, they denied her necessary care deliberately." Deborah's mind raced, the pieces were falling into place, why Martin had been so insistent about handling Cynthia's prenatal care, why he kept pushing to move the wedding date up. "How many others?" she asked. "At least 12 that I know of, but Cynthia's different, she's your sister, they can't just make her disappear like the others. That's why they're rushing everything, the wedding, the adoption arrangements. Once you're married to Martin, they'll have legal leverage over the whole family." Deborah's phone buzzed again, another text from Cynthia. "Martin's here, he's taking Mom and me to dinner to discuss the adoption papers before the wedding, I'm scared." Deborah's hands steadied as she typed her response, "Stay calm, act normal, I'm coming home early, tell him the fellowship ends next week." After Janet left, Deborah stood at her window, watching London's lights blur through the rain. She'd come here seeking professional growth, but she'd found something far more valuable, the truth. And with it, a plan began to form. She opened her laptop and booked a flight home, then she made 2 more calls, one to her mother's oncologist, Dr. Kraft, Ed's sister as she'd recently discovered, and another to a journalist she'd met at a conference, one known for exposing medical fraud. The pieces were in place. In 1 week, she'd be home. In 3 weeks, she'd walk down the aisle, and if everything went according to plan, the truth would come out in a way that would protect her family and expose the Lancasters' crimes once and for all. What Deborah didn't know was that Martin had plans of his own. Even now, he was sitting across from Cynthia and Patricia at an upscale restaurant, sliding a document across the table, adoption papers already dated and ready to sign. And in a private room at St. Mary's Hospital, Ed Kraft was waking up from a coma, his first words a warning: "Deborah, trap, wedding." The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of 2 families and expose decades of darkness. But who would survive the fallout? The answer lay hidden in one final piece of evidence, a piece that Deborah hadn't discovered yet, but soon would, because sometimes the most damaging secrets are the ones kept by those we trust most. "The dress looks perfect," Patricia Reynolds said, her eyes glistening as she watched Deborah stand before the mirror at the final fitting, 1 week before the wedding. Mother and daughter were alone in the bridal boutique's private room, their reflections multiplied by the 3-way mirror. Deborah smoothed the white silk, her fingers brushing over the hidden pocket she'd had sewn into the skirt, just large enough to hold a USB drive and a small digital recorder. "Everything has to be perfect," she agreed, meeting her mother's eyes in the mirror. The past 2 weeks since her return from London had been a carefully choreographed dance, every smile to Martin, every excited discussion about wedding details, every casual mention of their future together, all part of an elaborate performance. But beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding. Last night's dinner with the Lancasters played back in her mind, a toast. Richard Lancaster had announced, raising his crystal glass, "To the union of our families." His smile hadn't reached his eyes as he looked at Deborah, and to new beginnings. Martin had squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture that once would have brought comfort but now made her skin crawl. Across the table, Cynthia had pushed her food around her plate, her 7-month pregnancy impossible to hide now. Speaking of new beginnings, Richard had continued, Martin tells me Cynthia's been considering adoption, a very mature decision for someone so young. Deborah had felt her sister tense beside her.
Actually, Cynthia had said quietly, I've been thinking.
We have the perfect couple in mind, Richard had interrupted smoothly, clients of the firm. They've already set up a trust fund for the child's education. The implied threat had been clear: cooperation would be rewarded, resistance would have consequences. Now, watching her mother adjust the dresses train, Deborah thought about the evidence hidden in her apartment, the medical records Janet had provided, the testimony from former employees, the forensic accounting reports that traced millions in fraudulent insurance claims, and most damning of all, the security camera footage Ed had somehow obtained before his accident, footage that showed Richard Lancaster entering the parking garage where Deborah's father's car had been parked the night of his death.
Mom, Deborah said softly, turning from the mirror, do you trust me?
With my life, Patricia answered without hesitation, with all our lives. Then I need you to do something. The night before the wedding, take Cynthia to Aunt Helen's house in Vermont.
Don't tell anyone where you're going, just do it.
Deborah, please, Mom, I can't explain everything yet, but I promise you'll understand soon.
I just need to know you and Cynthia will be safe.
Her mother's face reflected years of hidden pain and understanding.
This is about more than Martin and the baby, isn't it? This is about your father.
Deborah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. I knew, Patricia whispered, deep down, I always knew his death wasn't an accident. The way Richard Lancaster swooped in afterward, offering to handle the insurance, getting me into that experimental treatment program. She straightened, a fierce light in her eyes.
What do you need me to do?
Before Deborah could answer, her phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Kraft, he's awake, come now. At St. Mary's Hospital, 20 minutes later, Deborah slipped into Ed's room. He lay pale against the white sheets, but his eyes were alert. They know, he said without preamble, his voice hoarse. Martin found the backup drive in my office, they're planning something for the wedding.
Deborah's heart raced.
What? I don't know exactly, but Richard met with the board of your mother's treatment program yesterday, and Martin's been asking questions about Cynthia's prenatal care, specific questions about complications. The implications turned Deborah's blood to ice. They weren't just planning to force Cynthia to give up her baby, they were plotting something far worse. There's more, Ed continued, glancing at the door. The night your father died, Martin was there too. He was just starting at the firm, eager to prove himself to his father.
The security footage doesn't show everything.
Deborah leaned closer.
What do you mean?
Your father wasn't just investigating insurance fraud, he discovered a pattern in young girls, forced adoptions, medical complications that weren't accidents, the same thing they're planning for Cynthia. He gripped her hand. The evidence you need isn't in the files I gave you, it's in their private server at the firm, but you'll only have one chance to access it.
When?
The morning of the wedding. Richard always works late the night before big events, then comes in early, but there's a window between 8:15 and 8:45 when the cleaning crew changes shifts. The security cameras loop during that time, his own precaution meant to hide his arrivals.
It's your only chance.
Deborah's mind raced. The wedding was scheduled for 11:15. If she could get into the office during that window, download the evidence. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Cynthia, Martin's here, he wants to take me to dinner, says we need to discuss the adoption papers before the wedding, go. Ed urged, but Deborah, be careful, they're not just criminals, they're monsters who've spent decades hiding behind respectability, and they're getting desperate. As Deborah hurried from the hospital, she didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street or the man inside taking photos. She was too focused on what needed to be done, the evidence she had to gather, the trap she had to set, the truth she had to expose. But the most crucial piece of evidence, the one that would blow everything wide open, was still waiting to be discovered, and it would come from the last person anyone would suspect, someone who had been watching, waiting, and gathering their own evidence all along. Because while Deborah had been planning her revelation at the wedding, another plan was taking shape. The question was, whose trap would spring first? The night before her wedding, Deborah sat in her car outside Lancaster and Wright Law, watching the cleaning crew's van pull into the underground parking garage. The dashboard clock read 8:12 a.m., 3 minutes until her window of opportunity. Her phone lay silent on the passenger seat. She'd sent her last text to Martin an hour ago, can't wait for tomorrow, everything's ready. It wasn't exactly a lie, everything was ready, just not in the way he expected. She thought back to the previous night, to her mother and Cynthia's departure for Vermont. Martin had been furious when he discovered they'd left, but Deborah had managed to calm him with a carefully crafted explanation about pre-wedding family traditions and superstitions. The relief of knowing they were safe had given her the strength for what came next. 8:15 a.m. Deborah pulled on latex gloves, no fingerprints, and grabbed her tablet with the security system override codes Ed had provided. The building's back entrance would be unlocked during the shift change. All she needed was 12 minutes to access Richard's private server and download the evidence. The service elevator opened silently on the 14th floor. Deborah moved quickly down the dark hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Richard's corner office lay ahead, its mahogany door gleaming like dried blood in the emergency lights. The lock yielded to Ed's code. Deborah slipped inside, closing the door behind her. She'd been here before for family dinners and celebrations, but never alone. The vast office felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, more threatening, as if the shadows themselves held secrets. Her fingers flew across Richard's keyboard, entering the complex series of passwords. The monitor hummed to life, casting a blue glow across her face. File directories appeared, and Deborah began her search. A sound in the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps? No, just the building's heating system cycling on. 8 minutes left. The file names scrolled past: client records, financial statements, adoption papers. Then something caught her eye, a folder labeled Reynolds Mitchell cases, her father's last name and her mother's maiden name. Inside, she found hundreds of documents spanning more than a decade: medical records of young girls, insurance claim denials, adoption arrangements, bank transfers, and most shocking of all, surveillance photos of her father, of Ed, of Cynthia, of herself. They'd been watching them for years, long before Martin had entered their lives. Her father's investigation hadn't been random, he'd been specifically targeted because of what her mother had discovered while working as a nurse years ago. Deborah's hands shook as she copied the files. A particular document caught her attention: a series of emails between Richard and Martin from the night her father died. "It's done," Martin had written, "car's been taken care of, Mitchell won't make it to the meeting." Richard's response: "Good, now about the nurse's daughter." The timestamp made Deborah's blood run cold. These emails had been sent years before she'd met Martin. Their entire relationship had been orchestrated from the beginning. More files revealed the true scope of the Lancasters' operation: dozens of young girls like Cynthia, their pregnancies managed by the firm, babies placed with wealthy clients, medical complications arranged when mothers became difficult, all of it connected to a network of corrupt hospital administrators and insurance companies. A soft click behind her made Deborah's heart stop. "I had a feeling you'd come here." She turned slowly. Janet Wright stood in the doorway, but not the nervous, frightened Janet who'd visited her in London. This Janet stood straight, confident, holding a small revolver. "I have to admit, you surprised us all," Janet continued, stepping into the office. "We thought you'd confront Martin immediately after London, but you waited, planned. Very impressive." "You're working with them," Deborah said, her mind racing. The pieces shifted, rearranged: Janet's convenient appearance in London, the perfectly organized evidence, the timing of it all. "For 20 years, Janet nodded. "Someone has to manage the details, keep the records, ensure loose ends are tied up. Like your father, he was unfortunate collateral damage, just like you'll be. A tragic accident on your wedding day, the stress, the excitement, a fatal fall down the church steps, perhaps." Janet's smile was cold. "Martin's grieving widower status will give him custody rights to Cynthia's baby, everything works out." But as Janet spoke, Deborah noticed something in the office's reflection on the window behind the desk: a shadow moving in the hallway. She kept talking, playing for time. "How many others? How many lives have you destroyed?" "Destroyed?" Janet laughed. "We've built families, created futures. Yes, there are costs, but progress always requires sacrifice." The shadow in the hallway grew larger. "And Cynthia, what about her future?" "Cynthia will have the best medical care money can buy, right up until the moment we decide she doesn't." Janet raised the gun. "Now, step away from the computer." "I don't think so," the new voice came from the doorway. Janet spun around and found herself facing Dr. Kraft, Ed's sister, holding her own weapon with the steady hands of someone who'd served in combat medicine. "Linda," Janet breathed, "you're supposed to be in surgery." "Changed my schedule," Dr. Kraft said coldly. "Drop the gun, Janet, it's over." But Janet's finger tightened on the trigger. It's not over until the gunshot was deafening in the confined space. Janet stumbled, her weapon clattering to the floor, red spreading across her shoulder. Dr. Kraft moved quickly, kicking Janet's gun away and using her medical skills to ensure the wound wasn't fatal. "The police are already on their way," she told Deborah. "Ed called them as soon as the security camera loop started. We've been waiting for Janet to show her hand for weeks." Deborah's tablet beeped, "Download complete." She had everything: the evidence of decades of crime, the proof of her father's murder, the documentation of their plans for Cynthia. "Thank you," she said to Dr. Kraft, "but why help us?" Linda Kraft's face hardened. "Because 18 years ago, my best friend was one of their cases. She died during a supposedly routine C-section, and her baby disappeared into their adoption network. I've been gathering evidence ever since, waiting for a chance to bring them down. When Ed told me about your plan, police sirens wailed in the distance." Deborah pocketed the tablet and stood, straightening her clothes. "The wedding starts in 2 hours," she said, "just enough time." But as she turned to leave, Janet's pained laugh stopped her. "You think this is enough? Richard and Martin have contingency plans. The moment they're arrested, every record of your mother's experimental treatment will vanish, and Cynthia, poor Cynthia, won't make it to her next checkup." Deborah smiled for the first time that morning. "That's where you're wrong, Janet. Cynthia and my mother are safely away, and in 1 hour, every major news outlet in the country will receive copies of these files. This is not just over for the Lancasters, it's over for everyone involved." She stepped into the hallway, leaving Janet with Dr. Kraft and the approaching sounds of police. In her purse, her phone buzzed with a text from Martin. "Where are you? The photographer wants to start early." Deborah typed back, "On my way, can't wait to see you at the altar," and she meant it. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold, it's served in front of 300 witnesses with proof that would destroy not just a corrupt family but an entire network of criminals who'd hidden behind wealth and respectability for far too long. The sun was rising over the city as Deborah drove toward the church. In 2 hours, she would walk down the aisle, but first, she had one more stop to make and one final piece of evidence to collect from the last person anyone would suspect. St. Ed's Church stood silhouetted against the morning sky, its stone walls holding decades of secrets. Deborah sat in her car across the street, watching the wedding guests arrive. Her white dress lay carefully protected in the back seat, but she wasn't ready to put it on, not yet. She had one last meeting. The coffee shop across from the church was nearly empty this early. In the far booth, a familiar figure waited: Rebecca Mitchell, her father's younger sister, whom Deborah hadn't seen since the funeral 10 years ago. "You look just like him," Aunt Rebecca said as Deborah slid into the booth. James always had that same determined look when he was onto something. Deborah placed a manila envelope on the table. "Is it true, what you wrote in the letter?" Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "Every word. I was a nurse at Lancaster Memorial back then, working in the maternity ward. I was the one who first noticed the pattern: healthy young mothers dying from complications, their babies disappearing into private adoptions. I told James about it, and he started investigating. He was careful, gathered evidence slowly, but someone must have tipped off Richard Lancaster." Rebecca's voice caught. "The night James died, he called me. He said he had proof that went beyond just the adoptions, evidence of medical experimentation, insurance fraud, murder. He was on his way to meet Ed Kraft when they killed him." Deborah finished, "But why didn't you come forward?" "They threatened Patricia's life. Your mother was pregnant with Cynthia at the time. I couldn't." Rebecca pulled out her own envelope. "But I never stopped watching, never stopped collecting evidence. This is everything I've gathered over the past decade, including proof that Martin Lancaster personally supervised the tampering with James's car." Deborah's phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Kraft. "Police have Janet in custody, she's talking. Richard Lancaster just arrived at the church, it's time." Deborah said, standing. She hesitated, then hugged her aunt tightly. "Stay here until it's over."
Be careful, Rebecca whispered, they're cornered now, that makes them more dangerous. In the church's bridal suite, 30 minutes later, Deborah stood before the mirror in her wedding dress. The USB drive felt heavy in its hidden pocket, along with her father's FBI contact card, the one found in his jacket the night he died, the final piece that connected everything. A knock at the door made her turn. Martin's mother, Elena Lancaster, stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Can we talk?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Deborah nodded, watching the older woman's reflection in the mirror. "I know what you've been doing," Elena said quietly, "the investigation, the evidence gathering. I know about Cynthia, about all of it." "And?" Deborah kept her voice steady. "I want to help." Elena's hands clasped and unclasped nervously. "I've spent 30 years looking the other way, telling myself the ends justified the means, but Cynthia, she's just a child, like all the others were, just children. Why should I trust you?" Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a small recorder. "Because I have the one thing you're missing: Richard's full confession. I've been recording his private conversations for months, ever since I found out about Cynthia, including his orders regarding your father's death." Deborah's heart raced. This was it, the final piece that would make the case airtight. But something in Elena's expression gave her pause. "What do you want in exchange?" "Protection," Elena said simply. "When this is over, when Richard and Martin are arrested, there will be people, powerful people, who will want everyone connected to this silenced. I need guarantees." Another knock at the door, the wedding coordinator. "5 minutes, Miss Reynolds." Deborah made her decision. "The FBI agent in the third pew, the one pretending to be my mother's cousin, tell him everything, he'll arrange witness protection." Elena handed over the recorder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of it." As the older woman left, Deborah's phone lit up with a series of texts. From Cynthia, "On our way back, don't worry about us." From Dr. Kraft, "Ed is being moved to a secure facility, he's safe." From Aunt Rebecca, "Police cars gathering 2 blocks away, ready when you are." From the journalist she'd contacted, "Live feed set up, every major network standing by." Deborah took a deep breath and opened her father's old case notebook, the one she'd found hidden in Aunt Rebecca's attic. His last entry read, "Sometimes justice comes dressed as a bride." The wedding march began to play. Through the small window, Deborah could see the packed church. Martin standing at the altar with his best man, Richard Lancaster, in the front pew, wearing a smile of triumph. None of them knew that Cynthia was about to walk through those doors with a baby in her arms and years of secrets ready to spill. Deborah smiled at her reflection and lifted her veil. It was time to give them a wedding they'd never forget. But as she prepared to make her entrance, a final text message arrived from a number she didn't recognize. "Camera crew in place, remember our deal, take them all down." Who was this mysterious ally? The answer would shock everyone in the church, most of all Martin Lancaster, because sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you're watching for, it's the one who's been sleeping beside you all along. The old church doors groaned as Deborah began her walk down the aisle. 300 faces turned to watch her, digital cameras and phones raised to capture the moment. Perfect, the more witnesses the better. Martin stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, wearing that practiced smile she'd once found charming. Now she saw it for what it was, a mask as carefully constructed as the respectable image his family had hidden behind for decades. Behind him, Richard Lancaster sat in the front pew, radiating satisfaction, the architect of so much suffering, thinking he was about to witness his greatest triumph. Neither of them noticed the small red lights of news cameras hidden among the flower arrangements or the number of guests who weren't quite what they seemed: FBI agents, journalists, survivors of the Lancaster schemes, gathered by Dr. Kraft and Aunt Rebecca over the past weeks. Deborah reached the altar, taking her place beside Martin.